On January 8, 1959, Fidel Castro and his army successfully overthrew Cuba's dictator Fulgencio Batista, causing the country of Cuba to become communist under Castro's rule. This alerted the US, because there was now a communist country only 100 miles away from US shore. So, the Americans decided that they should try to overthrow the Cuban government with an invasion. The CIA trained anti-communist Cuban exiles to land in Cuba and overthrow Castro, which would in the end get rid of the communist regime in Cuba. However, the Cubans were poorly trained, which resulted in this operation failing miserably. On April 15, 1961, the invasion started. Within 3 days, the American troops were defeated. From the 1,500 ground forces sent, 118 were killed and 1,202 were captured. This made Castro realize he had to improve his relationship with the Soviet Union.
A year later, in April 1962, Khrushchev discovered that the United States had stationed ballistic missiles in Turkey, which was very close to the Soviet border. He became frightened and wanted a base near the enemy of his own. Coincidentally, Cuba wanted the Soviet Union as an ally, so they made an agreement concerning the placement of missiles in Cuba. In July 1962, Soviet ships departed from the Black Sea port. None of the crew members knew where they were going, not even the ship's captains. Instead, they were given three envelopes, each to be opened at a specific time, with further instructions inside. On their way, the ships were photographed by American planes. America became suspicious, for the cargo was concealed. When they arrived, they unloaded the fighter jets, patrol boats, and trucks. They would only unload the nuclear missiles at night, so the Americans weren't able to photograph them.
In August 1962, an American U-2 spy plane photographed several surface-to-air missile sites in Cuba, which indicated that the Soviets were protecting something. The ballistic missiles, however, were still hidden and weren't seen. On October 14th, a U-2 came back with photographic evidence of actual missiles. On the picture there were cylindrical shapes of about 30 meters long, which turned out to be Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles, or MRBMs. With further photographic interpretation, they discovered more and more missile sites spread around Cuba. On October 16th, President Kennedy was briefed on the situation. This meeting and the ones following were secretly recorded by President Kennedy. The group in this room, including Marshall Carter of the CIA, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and other important people, became known as the Executive Committee of National Council, or EXCOM. The first and easiest solution they came up with was to launch airstrikes at the missile sites before they became operational, followed by an invasion of Cuba. But what they didn't know was that one site was almost fully operational. Another option was to order a naval blockade to stop other Soviet ships from arriving in Cuba, but the military executives were still in favor of an invasion.
On October 17th, another U-2 flight discovered intermediate-range ballistic missile sites, which made the situation even worse, because this meant that the Soviets could launch nuclear missiles to almost any destination in the United States. On October 18th, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko assured Kennedy the missiles were only there for defensive purposes. Kennedy knew otherwise, but he did not tell Gromyko. Kennedy still disagreed with the airstrike plans, because he thought the Soviets would take Berlin as a counterattack. In fear of making the naval blockade sound like the Berlin blockade, they named it a quarantine. Meanwhile, United States Marines departed from San Diego on their way to Cuba. Also, the CIA confirmed that at least one missile site was operational. Since Kennedy had wanted to launch an airstrike before any sites were operational, this plan now became a no-go.
On October 22nd, US Navy ships were ordered to enforce a blockade of Cuba. That same day at 7 p.m., President Kennedy publicly announced the ongoing situation in Cuba and their plan for a quarantine.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Afterwards, the whole world wondered what would happen next, for all of them were scared of a nuclear war. Also, the US Strategic Air Command placed the armed forces at a higher alert, DEFCON 3. The ships forming the blockade had now taken position 1,300 kilometers away from Cuba. On October 23rd, Kennedy received a letter from Khrushchev in which he said that there's a serious threat to peace and the security of peoples. So Kennedy decided to give Khrushchev more time and pulled the quarantine back to 800 kilometers from Cuba.
At the United Nations, the ambassador of the United States, Adlai Stevenson, openly showed photographs of the missiles in Cuba. Now the entire United Nations had proof of the Soviet missiles. October 24th. There was tension at the blockade between several Soviet submarines and the United Nations Navy ships. This made the United States Strategic Air Command increase to DEFCON 2, highest ever in the United States history. Everywhere in the United States, planes were being loaded with nuclear weapons in preparation for war.
On October 26th, the White House received a message saying that the Soviet ships had stopped or reversed direction. Kennedy thought that the quarantine alone could not force Cuba to remove Soviet missiles from their land. The CIA reported that there was no halt of any kind in the preparation of the missiles. Washington's KGB station chief Alexander Fomin proposed a solution. He stated that the Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba if Kennedy openly announced not to invade Cuba. In the following days, Khrushchev sent several letters in which he agreed with his proposition, but only if the US would also remove their missiles from Turkey. Kennedy agreed to this, though he did not publicly say that he'd remove their missiles from Turkey, in fear of losing his already weak image of a tough president.
These 2 weeks nearly brought the world to a nuclear war, which would have devastated all of society. It is President Kennedy who, with all his knowledge and good decisions, managed to stop this from happening. And after this incident, a hotline was put up between the President of the United States and the Soviet Union to make negotiations easier and faster.